The figures were quite a lot worse, really. And yet, in the 2019 and 2020 years, somehow magically you had more or less the same surplus projected as before. And is there an easy way of explaining that? Because a lot of people say that's a bit of smoke and mirrors.
Well, the reason that the underlying deterioration in the forecast took place is basically that we have a weaker outlook for economic growth and therefore a weaker outlook for tax revenues. That's the main driver there. In terms of how the hole has been refilled in 2019-20, it's partly by announcing that there's going to be less expenditure on public services in that year. That, as you mentioned earlier on, is to be partly funded by an efficiency review, which we'll be supposedly reporting in 2018. But there's also things that move money in between years of the forecast. So there's a big £6 billion slug of tax on corporate profits, which has been moved into that year, and there's some capital investment spending that has been moved out. That doesn't affect the underlying health of the public finances, but there are measures that do, as I say, like public expenditure.
No, you see, that's quite interesting, isn't it? Because 2019 is the thing they've set their credibility against, which is having a surplus in that year. And a lot of people looking at it say, hang on, they've done this retiming of corporation tax receipts that shoves £6 billion into that year, which more or less accounts for half or more of the surplus they've achieved. You presumably aren't allowed to use the word smoke and mirrors, correct? Or?
No, our job is to make as transparent as possible how this has been achieved. It's for other people to apply the adjectives.
Mirrors and smoke, perhaps. Productivity is a big story in this. It's turned out disappointing. Just to be clear, your growth forecasts have come down, I think, more than a lot of people thought. So pessimism on growth, still growing all the way through, but a bit of pessimism. What was driving that? Was that the productivity assumption that we weren't quite as productive as we'd hoped? Or was it something to do with China and the world economy?
It's mostly the productivity assumption. The striking feature, not just in the UK, but in many other economies, is that productivity, which is the amount of output you get out of every hour worked, has been growing much less quickly after the financial crisis than it did beforehand. We were assuming that you would get back to the pre-crisis rate of growth relatively swiftly. The figures that we had at the time of the November forecast showed productivity growth picking up quite nicely in the middle of last year, along with earnings growth. But that's fizzled away in the fourth quarter of the year. So that's left you with this period of weak post-crisis productivity growth getting longer, and we've placed more weight on that as a guide to the medium term. But interestingly, although this is not a forecast revision driven by news from the outside world, it's not something that's unique to the UK. So if you look at the revisions the Congressional Budget Office has made in the US to trend productivity, they're almost exactly the same.
Everybody's problem, of course, we're starting from a lower base because we have a lower productivity rate. Look, I should also ask you, because the Chancellor was quoting you with abandon on Brexit and the horrific consequences that would flow if we vote to leave the EU. Looking at the document, it wasn't clear that you'd really modelled this or done any work on this. What is the truth of your position on Brexit?
Well, Parliament has told us to produce our forecasts on the basis of current government policy and not to look at any alternatives. Current government policy is to stay in the EU, so our forecasts are done on that basis. So we haven't done any projections of what difference it would make if we left.
But he was quoting you as though you had.
But what we have also pointed out is that if you look at the things that city economists and other economists are saying, if there was to be a vote to leave, then people expect a period of uncertainty while the new relationship with the EU is negotiated, and that could have implications for consumer and business confidence and financial markets. So we cited what other people have been saying.
But you've done no work on that.
But we've made no explicit
Okay, so no one should really quote you as being an expert on that particular topic.
No.
Correct. Robert, thank you very much.